In this video, I'm going to talk about the Homophonic Orchestral Texture from George Frederick Mackay's book, Creative Orchestration. In that book, he outlines 8 different orchestral textures. So today we'll talk about the homophonic, and there are 7 other videos for the 7 other textures. We'll start by looking at Mozart Symphony No. 40 in G minor, and then we'll take the Breath of the Wild theme and apply the homophonic texture to it. There are a few more videos left in this series, so to make sure you don't miss out on those, please remember to subscribe. So the homophonic texture is another one of those that I think is a little bit misnamed, because I think that sounds like it would be more of the monophonic or even the chordal texture. One sound doesn't really fit this, because the homophonic texture is what we really commonly know as a melody with accompaniment. It's probably the one you're going to use the most and find the most examples of. So those of us who come from a rock or jazz background are in luck, because the homophonic texture is the closest that we're used to of having some sort of top line, a melody or a singer or a solo, and then a rhythm section underneath where you have the chord tones and some sort of rhythm pattern, maybe a groove or an ostinato. But what I really like about Mackay's book is that this is just one of 8 different textures, and there's so many interesting ways to orchestrate your music and to keep things interesting and varied that we shouldn't only be using the homophonic. So there are plenty of examples to choose from for the homophonic texture. I chose Mozart Symphony No. 40 in G minor, partly because it's just a nice example of the theme, but he does some interesting things with choosing his chord tones that we will look at as we get into this. So the structure here is pretty simple. You can see in violin 1 and violin 2, we have the main melody, which is a pretty active line. In the violas, we have the chord tones and this kind of chugging rhythmic pattern in eighth notes. And then in the cellos and basses, we have that quarter note hitting the downbeat every bar of the bass note. So first, let's just hear how these basic parts sound on their own. So here's the melody line. Here's that accompanying pattern in the violas. And then the cello and bass just hitting that bass note on the bottom. So one of the things you might notice is that there's a lot of separation of range. The melody is very high, the violas are in this kind of middle range. Remember that center line in the viola is middle C, and then the cellos and basses are down in the bottom. So this is typically how you're going to want to do this. You're going to want to have your melody in one pitch range, your chord tones in another, and then maybe like a kick drum or a bass very much at the bottom. So one of the reasons I chose this piece as an example is because his chord tone choices in the viola are very intentional. He didn't just lay down the triads underneath and see what happened. I'm not really used to reading an alto clef, so it might help if we change this to look at where it actually is. And if we compare the violin 2, which is the lower octave of the melody, and the viola, we can actually see that there's some gap where this goes on. So if we take this melody line and we put it in with the viola, we can really see what's going on. In many places, the viola is actually staying out of the way of the melody, and for most of the time, we're getting all 3 pitches of the chord, all 3 notes in the triad. So here, sometimes the melody is over, but sometimes the melody even goes in between, and that viola goes over. If the bottom octave was the only octave of the melody, I would advise against doing this, because sometimes it would sound like the viola was on top. It would be kind of confusing. Because it's reinforced with that octave above in the violin 1, there's really not any problem there with this blend. But you can see that it was very intentional. If he's here on this chord and he's thinking, I have this G minor chord, should I just lay down G, D, B flat? You can see that he already has this D and this upper neighbor E flat in the melody line, so he doesn't need those in the chords. So he only puts the G and the B flat, which are the tones he's missing. And this goes through the whole way like this. There's a few places of doubling, but for the most part, it's very intentionally chosen. The melody has one chord tone, the viola will take care of the other 2. Let's listen to the whole thing. So now let's take the Breath of the Wild theme and orchestrate it using the homophonic texture. So the first thing I'll do is bring up a piano so that I can write a sketch. So the reason I like to use a piano sketch is because it's so much easier to look at 2, 3, 4 lines instead of 20, 50, however many lines you're going to have in your orchestra. This is just so much easier to conceptualize and think about. And also, if you're not too worried about what the colors are, you're going to get less distracted by loading up samples and playing with patches and all those things. Try to keep it focused in the piano in sketch mode before you move on to the full page. It makes everything easier. To get started, why don't we lay down just a nice solid bass line on quarter notes. And now I'm going to look for some sort of rhythmic pattern in between. I think it might be nice and simple if we double the melody up there. So as far as generally where to pick my chord tones and where to put them, as a very general rule, without worrying too much about the specific low interval limits, generally this octave between this low C and middle C and then maybe a fifth above it is a pretty good place to fit your chord tones. A good rule of thumb I've heard before is that the simpler and more sustained your melody, the farther away you should stretch it from your accompaniment, because it will be too easily absorbed if it's too simple. If your melody is fairly active like this one is, then you don't really have to worry about being too far away from your chords, because it's probably going to stand out anyway. So let's copy that idea from the Mozart of this kind of chugging along eighth notes thing. In that piece, we were in a 2/4, 4/4 meter, and here we're in 3/4, so it's a little different, but I think we could get away with something like this. And the reason I chose those chord tones is here I have that G in the melody, so I don't need it. Even though I go to the C here, I don't want to be switching more than every quarter note, so I'm going to sustain that. But then here my note is a C, so then I want to be chugging along on those guys that are the other chord tones, the G and the E flat. So if we keep that up, we have a G there, so we're pretty open. What we're missing in this chord is the C and the E flat, so we could do that again. That would stay pretty consistent, and then so here you can see I have the E flat in the melody, so I'm going to spread that up. Let's go all the way up. Try and decide, do I want that or that? Let's do that so that we don't get too far away from ourselves. So notice that once I established a pattern in bar 1, I stuck with it for the whole 8 bars. That's really a good idea for just delineating your form, making it very clear section by section where we are. I will often use cadence points for highlights and interesting things, but generally once you pick a texture, you want to stay with it. So let's just transfer this very easily over to the strings. So I'm really just going to transfer this piano sketch over to the string orchestra top down. So we had that top line in violin 1, we'll take the next one an octave lower. We're going to put this on violas divisi, which is simple as this, and then we'll put this bass line in the lower parts. We can delete our piano sketch. Now let's add some phrasing real quick, make it a little bit faster. I think I'd prefer if this was pits, just so it wasn't so clunky on the bottom. You as well. So there are plenty of other things you could do here. We didn't have to do this only on the string orchestra. We could have put this in the winds. We could have put the melody on the violins, and that viola part would also sound pretty nice probably in the clarinets or maybe in the French horns, and all sorts of other colorful, interesting things we could do. But just the basic idea here is that we have a melody, we have chord tones, and we have some sort of rhythmic pattern. That is the homophonic texture. It's one we're all pretty familiar with, so this should have been pretty straightforward to watch. And then the other thing was just deciding, you know, which chord tone do I want, and you don't need to always have all of them in your accompaniment part if they're already present in the bass line or in the melody. For example, when we hit this C here, I already had it, so I put the E flat and the G in the accompaniment part. There it is, so let's take a listen. So that's the homophonic texture, one that you're going to be using plenty of times, but one that you don't want to overuse. Just because it's so easy to use doesn't mean you always need to do it. A lot of times I think the polythematic texture that we talked about last time would probably be a good substitute in places where you think this is the one you need. And the biggest difference here between the homophonic and the polythematic is that the polythematic took that accompaniment part and made it more individualistic, made it more unique and kind of its own line, its own theme in its own right, whereas here that viola part is pretty secondary and it's really not as important, not as interesting as the violin 1, violin 2 parts. So I'm going to do one more video about textures where we take all 8 and talk about hybrid textures, how you could use some of those different 8 in different combinations and the effects you get there. And for the finale of this series, I'll make a video where I take all 8 Breath of the Wild orchestrations and put them into one file back to back, so you can hear the differences between each of them immediately after one another. So to make sure you don't miss when those 2 videos are ready to go, please remember to subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.